The expensive fabric tore with a sickening sound, and the laughter that followed was even worse. Celeste Vaughan stood there, the remnants of her evening gown hanging in tatters, while three men in designer suits circled like wolves, their phones out, recording, their voices loud with entitlement. In a room full of witnesses, not one person moved, not one hand reached out. That's when the quiet man in the corner booth finally looked up from his whiskey. Thorne Ashford's fingers stopped mid-swirl on the glass rim. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept across the scene with the precision of someone who had seen worse and dealt with it. No one noticed the shift in his posture, the way his presence seemed to expand and fill the room, or how the temperature dropped with his silence. But Celeste did. She saw something that made her breath catch. Not a hero rushing in, but a predator who had just marked his prey. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that before this night ended, these men would be on their knees, not begging her for forgiveness, but him. The Sapphire Lounge had always been the kind of place where power players came to celebrate their victories over $15 cocktails and overpriced appetizers. Tonight was no different. The low amber lighting cast warm shadows across leather booths, and soft jazz hummed through hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of casual elegance that attracted Manhattan's elite like moths to flame. Thorne Ashford had chosen this particular corner booth 3 months ago when he'd first discovered the place, not because of the view or the service, but because it offered something far more valuable: anonymity. He'd spent the last 5 years cultivating invisibility, and he'd gotten remarkably good at it. The faded denim jacket he wore tonight had seen better days, as had the plain grey shirt underneath. His boots were scuffed, practical, the kind a construction worker might wear after a long shift. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or influence. Nothing suggested that the man nursing a glass of whiskey in the corner controlled more assets than everyone in this room combined. That was exactly how he wanted it. After his wife Amelia had died, after the photographers had stalked his grief and turned his mourning into entertainment, Thorne had made a choice. He'd stepped back from the public eye, handed the day-to-day operations of Ashford Industries to trusted executives, and become a ghost in his own empire. Most nights, he came here simply to watch, to observe the theater of human behavior without participating in it. He'd see the business deals negotiated over cognac, the affairs that bloomed over shared desserts, the friendships that fractured over perceived slights. It was easier than going home to an empty penthouse where Amelia's paintings still hung on the walls and her coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter because he couldn't bring himself to move it. The whiskey helped. Not enough to dull the edges completely, but enough to make the silence bearable. Tonight had started like any other. He'd arrived at 8, ordered his usual Macallan neat, and settled into his observation post. The crowd was typical for a Friday. Young executives celebrating the end of another week, a few older couples enjoying a rare night out, and the occasional solo drinker like himself seeking refuge from their own thoughts. Then she'd walked in, and the energy in the room had shifted like a sudden change in barometric pressure. Celeste Vaughan moved through the space with the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding boardrooms. Her evening gown was midnight blue, simple but clearly expensive, and she wore it like armor. Thorne recognized her immediately. Her face had been on the cover of Forbes last month, celebrating her company's latest acquisition. Vaughan Tech had disrupted the telecommunications industry in just under a decade, and Celeste was the architect of that disruption. At 42, she was one of the youngest female CEOs in the Fortune 500, and from what Thorne had read, she'd earned every bit of that success through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. She'd come alone, which surprised him. Women like Celeste Vaughan usually traveled with an entourage, assistants, security, hangers-on hoping to catch some reflected glory. But tonight she was solo, and she'd taken a seat at the bar with the air of someone who desperately needed a moment of peace. Thorn had watched her order a martini, watched the bartender's eyes widen in recognition, watched her put a finger to her lips in a universal gesture of, "Please don't make a fuss." She'd wanted anonymity too, it seemed. The universe had a dark sense of humor. The three men had arrived 20 minutes later, loud and already drunk, their voices carrying across the room like foghorns. They wore suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but money couldn't buy class, and these three had none. Thorn had pegged them immediately, mid-level finance types, the kind who made 6 figures and thought it made them kings. They'd positioned themselves near the bar, ordering rounds of top-shelf liquor and making comments just loud enough to ensure everyone knew how important they thought they were. Thorn had seen their type before. Hell, he'd employed their type before, back when he'd still been actively running his company. They were the ones who confused aggression with leadership, who mistook cruelty for strength. They were the reason he'd implemented strict behavioral codes and zero-tolerance harassment policies across all his holdings. Some lessons he'd learned had to be taught the hard way. The tallest of the three, a man with slicked-back hair and a Rolex that caught the light with every gesture, had noticed Celeste first. Thorn had watched the recognition dawn on his face, watched him nudge his companions and whisper something that made them all laugh. Then they'd approached her like sharks, scenting blood in the water. The conversation had started innocently enough, or at least it had appeared that way from Thorn's vantage point. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read body language fluently, and Celeste's had gone from relaxed to rigid in the span of seconds. She'd smiled politely at first, the kind of professional smile that said, "I'm acknowledging your existence, but please leave me alone." They hadn't taken the hint. The tall one had moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that made her lean back. His hand had landed on the bar beside her, boxing her in. She'd said something sharp. Thorn could tell by the way her chin lifted and her eyes flashed. And for a moment, he'd thought they'd back off. Instead, they'd laughed harder, and the tall one had leaned in even closer, his lips nearly touching her ear. That's when Celeste had stood up, trying to create distance, trying to extract herself from a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. She'd been polite about it, professional even, reaching for her clutch and clearly intending to simply leave. And that's when the tall one had grabbed her arm. Not roughly, not at first, but firmly enough to make it clear she wasn't going anywhere until he was finished with whatever game he was playing. Thorn's fingers had tightened on his glass then, his first real reaction of the evening. He'd told himself to stay out of it, that she was a grown woman who could handle herself, that intervening would only draw the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. Then the tall one's other hand had moved to her waist, pulling her closer despite her obvious resistance, and one of his friends had pulled out his phone, already recording. The third man had grabbed the strap of her gown, ostensibly trying to pull her back toward them when she'd tried to step away. The fabric had been delicate, designed for elegance, not durability, and it had torn with a sound that cut through the jazz music and ambient conversation like a knife. For a single frozen moment, the entire bar had gone silent. Everyone had heard it. Everyone had seen it. Celeste stood there, one hand clutching the torn fabric to her chest, her face a mask of shock and humiliation. The three men had stared at their handiwork, and then they'd started laughing. Deep, genuine laughter, as if they'd just witnessed the funniest thing in the world. Thorn had watched the crowd's reaction with something close to disgust. Phones had come out immediately, but not to call for help. No, they'd come out to record, to capture this moment of someone else's degradation for the entertainment of strangers on the internet. The bartender had frozen, torn between professional obligation and self-preservation. The other patrons had suddenly found their drinks fascinating, their conversations urgent, anything to avoid getting involved. It was a masterclass in bystander effect, in the particular cowardice that overtook people when helping someone meant risking their own comfort. And in that moment, watching Celeste Vaughan stand alone in a room full of people who'd rather film her humiliation than prevent it, Thorn had felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He'd felt angry. Not the hot, immediate anger that led to bar fights and regrettable decisions. This was colder, more controlled, the kind of anger that Amelia used to say made him most dangerous. It was the anger of a man who'd spent too long watching the world's casual cruelties, too long telling himself that staying uninvolved was the same as staying safe. He'd set his glass down with deliberate care, the ice cubes chiming against crystal with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in his ears. Then he'd stood up, and for the first time in 5 years, Thorn Ashford had stepped back into the light. The walk from his booth to the bar took maybe 15 seconds, but Thorn used every one of them. He let his presence expand, let the weight of his attention settle on the 3 men like a physical thing. It was a trick he'd learned in boardrooms and business negotiations, how to take up space without saying a word, how to make people aware of you through pure force of will. By the time he reached them, the laughter had died in their throats, replaced by an uncertainty that showed in the way they shifted their weight and glanced at each other. "Gentlemen," Thorn said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "I think you need to leave." The tall one recovered first, his face settling into an expression of practiced arrogance. "And who the hell are you? Her boyfriend?" The emphasis he put on the last word made it an insult. "This is a private conversation, buddy. Why don't you go back to whatever blue-collar dive you crawled out of?" Thorn didn't react to the dismissal. He'd been underestimated before. It was part of his current strategy, actually. And he'd learned that people's assumptions about you could become their greatest weakness. Instead, he simply looked at the man, really looked at him, with the kind of assessment that made people squirm. "I'm going to give you a choice," Thorn said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "You can apologize to this woman, pay for her dress, and leave quietly, or you can make this difficult." The tall one laughed, but there was a brittle edge to it now. "Difficult for who? You? Look at you, man. You look like you can't even afford to drink here." His friends joined in, their laughter nervous but gaining confidence from their numbers. "Why don't you mind your own business before you get hurt?" one of them added, stepping closer in what he probably thought was a threatening manner. Thorn's expression didn't change. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. It was an older model, nothing fancy, which seemed to amuse the 3 men even more. But Thorn wasn't reaching for it to show off. He was reaching for it because it was time to end this charade. "Do any of you work in finance?" he asked, thumbing through his contacts. The question caught them off guard. The tall one straightened, pride overcoming caution. "Yeah, we work for Morrison Blake. Not that it's any of your business." Morrison Blake. Thorn knew the firm well. They were a mid-tier investment company that primarily dealt with corporate acquisitions. More importantly, they'd been trying to secure a meeting with Ashford Industries for the past 18 months, hoping to manage some of his portfolio. He'd been putting them off, not particularly impressed with their approach or their ethics. Looked like his instincts had been right. "Morrison Blake," Thorn repeated, almost to himself. "That's interesting." He pressed dial on a number he hadn't called in months, then held the phone to his ear. "What are you doing?" the tall one demanded, but there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now. The phone rang twice before a woman answered, her voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. "Mr. Ashford, this is unexpected." "Elizabeth," Thorn said, and he saw Celeste's eyes widen slightly at the name. "Good," she was quick. "I need you to pull our files on Morrison Blake. Everything we have." The confusion on the 3 men's faces would have been comical if the situation wasn't so ugly. "Morrison Blake," Elizabeth repeated, and Thorn could hear the click of her keyboard in the background. She was his executive assistant, the only person besides his lawyer who knew how to reach him directly. The investment firm, we've been considering them for the Patterson portfolio. We're considering them, Thorne corrected. Past tense. I want all discussions terminated immediately. And Elizabeth, I want you to make some calls. I want to know every company these three gentlemen work with, every client they represent, every deal they have in progress. Mr. Ashford, the tall one started, and now his face had gone pale. He'd finally put the pieces together, and Thorne could see the moment when arrogance collapsed into panic. That's right, Thorne said softly, lowering the phone but not ending the call. Thorne Ashford, the one whose company you've been begging to do business with for the past year and a half. The one who controls about 40% of the portfolio you're trying to build your career on. He let that sink in for a moment, watching the color drain from all three faces. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you going to apologize to Ms. Vaughan and leave quietly, or are we going to make this difficult? The second man, shorter and stockier than his friend, had started to back away already, his survival instincts overriding his bravado. Mr. Ashford, we didn't know. We didn't mean... You didn't mean to assault a woman in public? Thorne's voice remained quiet, but there was steel underneath now. You didn't mean to humiliate her. You didn't mean to destroy her property. What exactly didn't you mean to do? The tall one opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. It was just a joke. We were just having fun. Funny, Thorne said. Nobody's laughing. He raised the phone back to his ear. Elizabeth, are you getting all this? Every word, Mr. Ashford. Her voice carried through the speaker now, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm already drafting the communications. By Monday morning, every major firm in the city will know exactly what kind of behavior Morrison Blake tolerates from their employees. No, the third man said, his voice cracking. Please, you can't. My career. Your career? Celeste spoke for the first time, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. You tore my dress off in public, filmed it, laughed about it, and now you're worried about your career. The tall one took a step toward her, hands raised in what he probably thought was a placating gesture. Miss Vaughan, please, you have to understand. Don't, Thorne said quietly, and something in his tone stopped the man mid-step. Don't take another step toward her. Don't speak to her. You've done enough. He gestured to the floor in front of Celeste. Kneel. The word hung in the air like a judge's gavel. What? The tall one said weakly. You heard me. All three of you. On your knees. Apologize properly. For a moment, Thorne thought they might refuse, might try to cling to some shred of dignity. But then the shorter one dropped first, his knees hitting the polished floor with an audible thump. The third followed a second later. The tall one held out the longest, his face cycling through emotions, anger, humiliation, fear, before he too sank down, his expensive suit trousers wrinkling against the ground. We're sorry, the shorter one said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Vaughan, we're so sorry. We were drunk. We were stupid. You were cruel. Celeste interrupted, her voice steady now. There's a difference between stupid and cruel, and what you did was a choice. She looked down at them, and Thorne saw something fierce and unbroken in her expression, despite the torn dress she still clutched to her chest. You saw a woman alone, and you decided she was fair game. You thought your money and your status made you untouchable. You were wrong. You were... Thorne turned to address the rest of the bar, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Everyone who recorded this, everyone who stood by and did nothing, you're complicit in what happened here tonight. But you have a choice now. You can delete those videos, or you can explain to your employers, your families, your friends, why you thought this was entertainment worth preserving. The sound of deleting videos was immediate, a chorus of digital chirps as people suddenly discovered their moral compasses. It was too late, of course. Someone would have already uploaded something somewhere, but at least they were trying now. Better late than never, Thorne supposed, though not by much. He looked back down at the three men still kneeling on the floor. Morrison Blake will be receiving my formal complaint on Monday. I expect all three of you will be unemployed by Tuesday. Beyond that, whether Ms. Vaughan decides to press charges is entirely up to her. He paused, then added, "But if I were you, I'd spend the weekend finding a very good lawyer and praying she's more merciful than you deserve." The tall one looked up, tears actually streaming down his face now. "Please, Mr. Ashford, I have a family. I have kids." Thorne felt something cold settle in his chest. "Then I hope you teach them better than your parents taught you. Now get out of my sight." They scrambled to their feet and fled, practically running for the exit. The door swung shut behind them, and gradually the normal sounds of the bar resumed, conversations picking up, glasses clinking, nervous laughter as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Thorne turned to Celeste, who was still standing there, still holding her dress together, her expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, the adrenaline starting to fade and leaving him suddenly exhausted. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out a puzzle. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." The bartender materialized beside them, holding a folded jacket that Thorne recognized as belonging to the coat check. "Miss Vaughan, please, with our compliments." His face was red with shame. "I'm so sorry. I should have intervened. I should have called security. I froze." Celeste took the jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the torn dress. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Thorne heard the exhaustion in her voice, the delayed shock starting to set in. She swayed slightly, and he reached out instinctively to steady her. "I think you should sit down," he said gently. "Maybe have some water before you try to go home." She let him guide her to his booth, the corner one, away from prying eyes, and sank onto the leather seat with a long exhale. The bartender brought water and coffee without being asked, along with a plate of something that might have been chocolate cake. Comfort food. Thorne approved. He slid into the opposite side of the booth, giving her space, letting her process in her own time. They sat in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the bar washing over them like background noise. Celeste drank the water slowly, methodically, as if it were a task that required her full concentration. "Thorne Ashford," she said finally, setting the empty glass down. "I thought you were dead." He couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his mouth. "Common misconception. I prefer to think of it as strategically absent. You disappeared 5 years ago, after your wife—" She stopped, clearly unsure if she was crossing a line. "After Amelia died," Thorne finished for her. "Yes, I found that grief and public attention make poor companions, so I chose grief and obscurity instead." Celeste studied him with the same intensity she'd probably used to analyze countless business proposals. "You built one of the largest private equity firms in the country, then walked away from it. Why?" "Because none of it mattered without her," Thorne said simply. "The money, the power, the influence, it was all just noise. And when she was gone, the noise became unbearable." He ran a finger around the rim of his empty glass. "So I made it stop. Handed operations to people I trusted, set up systems that didn't need my constant input, and became a ghost in my own life." "That sounds lonely," Celeste said softly. "It is," Thorne admitted. "But it's a quieter kind of loneliness. The kind I can manage." She picked up her coffee, wrapped both hands around it like she was trying to warm herself, despite the bar's comfortable temperature. Thank you for what you did tonight. You didn't have to get involved. Yes, I did, Thorn said, and there was no room for argument in his tone. What they did to you was wrong. What everyone else did, standing by, recording it, treating your pain like entertainment, that was wrong too. Someone had to say so. Most people wouldn't have, Celeste said. Most people would have kept their heads down and stayed out of it. Most people, Thorn agreed. But I learned a long time ago that the world doesn't change because people do the easy thing. It changes when someone finally gets tired of the easy thing being the wrong thing. Celeste was quiet for a moment, then said, I built my company from nothing, you know. Started in a garage with a laptop and a dream. All the usual cliches. Spent 20 years clawing my way up in an industry that didn't want me there. And tonight, in less than 5 minutes, 3 strangers almost destroyed me. Not my company, not my reputation. Me. The person underneath all the titles and achievements. Her voice cracked slightly. They made me feel small, worthless, like I was nothing more than an object for their entertainment. You're not small, Thorn said firmly. You're not worthless. What they did says everything about them and nothing about you. Logically, I know that, Celeste said, staring into her coffee. But logic and feeling are different countries sometimes. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I was scared, Thorn. Really scared. And I hate that they made me feel that way. I hate that I'll probably never come to this bar again because the memory will be here waiting. I hate that they took something from me tonight that I can't get back. Thorn understood that feeling intimately. Grief had taken things from him too, the joy he'd found in his work, the pleasure of a beautiful sunset, the simple happiness of waking up in the morning. Some losses couldn't be recovered, only accommodated. They took your peace, he said quietly, your sense of safety, maybe some of your trust in strangers. Those are real losses, and you have every right to grieve them. He leaned forward slightly. But here's what they didn't take, couldn't take: your strength, your intelligence, your ability to build empires and change industries, your fundamental worth as a human being. All of that is still here, still yours. They can't touch it unless you let them. Celeste wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging mascara but not seeming to care. That's very wise for a man who spends his evenings hiding in corner booths. I've had a lot of time to think, Thorn said. 5 years of corner booths and quiet contemplation. You learn things in the silence. What have you learned? Celeste asked, and she seemed genuinely curious despite everything that had just happened. Thorn considered the question, really considered it. I've learned that the world is full of people like those 3 men, people who mistake cruelty for power, who think that stepping on others lifts them higher. But I've also learned that there are still people who'll stand up when it matters, even if it costs them something, even if it ruins their carefully constructed anonymity. He smiled wryly. I came here tonight wanting to be invisible. Instead, I made myself the most visible person in the room. Old habits die hard, I guess. You miss it, Celeste observed. The power, the influence, being in the arena instead of watching from the sidelines. It wasn't a question. Sometimes, Thorn admitted. But then I remember why I left, and the missing becomes manageable. He gestured around the bar. This is enough. Watching, observing, occasionally intervening when something demands intervention. It's a small life compared to what I had before, but it's mine. It doesn't ask more of me than I can give. Celeste set down her coffee and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What if I asked you for something? That depends on what you're asking, Thorn said carefully. Walk me home, Celeste said. I live 6 blocks from here. And I really don't want to be alone right now. I don't want to be afraid to walk 6 blocks in a city I've lived in for 20 years. It was a simple request, but Thorn understood the trust behind it. After what she'd just experienced, asking a strange man to walk her home required a leap of faith that most people wouldn't make. The fact that she was making it with him felt significant in a way he couldn't quite name. "I'd be honored," he said, standing and offering his hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet, keeping his touch respectful and brief. The bartender hurried over as they headed for the door. "Ms. Vaughn, please, there's no charge for tonight, and we'll be implementing new security protocols immediately. This will never happen again in our establishment." Celeste paused, then said, "See that it doesn't, and train your staff to intervene when they see harassment happening. Silence is complicity." The bartender nodded, chastened. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." Outside, the October air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of rain that might or might not materialize. The streets were busy despite the late hour, filled with people enjoying the Friday night energy of the city. Thorn stayed close to Celeste, but didn't crowd her, letting her set the pace and the distance. They walked in silence for the first block, just 2 people among hundreds, anonymous in the way that only cities allowed. "I almost left early tonight," Celeste said suddenly. "I almost didn't come at all, actually. I had this feeling, this sense that I should just go home and call it a night." "What made you stay?" Thorn asked. "Stubbornness," Celeste said with a slight smile. "I'd had a terrible week. 2 deals fell through. One of my board members is threatening to resign, and I found out this morning that my ex-husband is getting remarried to his assistant, who's 12 years younger than me." She shook her head. "I told myself I wasn't going to let any of it drive me out of my favorite bar. I was going to have my martini, decompress, and remind myself that I'm in control of my own life." "Are you?" Thorn asked. "In control of your own life?" Celeste was quiet for half a block. "I thought I was. I built my company on the idea that if I just worked hard enough, if I was smart enough and tough enough, I could control the outcomes. I could make things happen through sheer force of will." She pulled the borrowed jacket tighter around herself. "But tonight reminded me that there are things you can't control, people you can't predict. Moments when all your power and preparation mean nothing because someone else decides to take something from you." "That's terrifying," Thorn said. "Yes," Celeste agreed. "It is." They turned a corner, and Thorn recognized the neighborhood. Upscale, quiet, the kind of place where doormen knew your name and packages never went missing. "That's my building," Celeste said, pointing to an elegant pre-war structure with Art Deco flourishes around the entrance. "Thank you for walking with me." "And for earlier. For everything." Thorn stopped at the entrance, keeping a respectful distance. "You don't have to thank me for basic human decency. That should be the baseline, not the exception." "And yet it is exceptional," Celeste said. "Which tells you something about the world we live in." She hesitated, then said, "Would you have coffee with me sometime?" "Not tonight. I need to go upstairs and fall apart in private for a while. But maybe next week? I'd like to talk to someone who understands what it's like to walk away from the life you built." It was Thorn's turn to hesitate. Coffee meant visibility, meant stepping further out of the shadows he'd grown comfortable in. But looking at Celeste, seeing the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide beneath her executive composure, he found he couldn't say no. "Next week," he agreed. "There's a place in Brooklyn I like. Quiet, good coffee. Nobody bothers you." "Sounds perfect," Celeste said. She pulled a business card from her clutch, one of the few things that had survived the evening intact, and handed it to him. "My personal number's on there. Call me when you're ready. Thorn took the card, feeling the weight of what this meant. A week ago, he would have said no, would have retreated back to his corner booth and his carefully maintained isolation. But maybe 5 years was long enough to hide. Maybe Amelia would have wanted him to step back into the world eventually, even if it was just for coffee with a woman who understood what it meant to be broken and keep functioning anyway. I'll call, he promised. Celeste smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached her eyes. Good. I'll look forward to it. She turned toward the entrance, then paused and looked back. Thorn? Those men tonight, they thought they had power because they had money and status and numbers. But you had something they'll never understand. What's that? Thorn asked. You had conviction, Celeste said simply. You knew who you were and what you stood for, and that made you more powerful than anything they could buy or borrow or steal. Don't forget that. Before he could respond, she'd disappeared through the doors, nodding to the doorman who'd been watching their conversation with professional discretion. Thorn stood there for a moment, turning her business card over in his hands, feeling something shift inside him like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. Then he started walking back toward his own apartment, taking the long way, letting the city's night sounds wash over him. He thought about Amelia, about what she'd say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh at how long it had taken him to remember that hiding from pain didn't make it hurt less. It just made you smaller. She'd always been braver than him that way, always the first one to dive into the hard conversations and difficult emotions while he'd preferred strategy and planning and control. But tonight, he'd done something Amelia would have approved of. He'd seen someone who needed help, and he'd helped them. Consequences be damned. He'd remembered that there were things more important than his carefully constructed walls, more vital than his comfortable isolation. He'd remembered what it felt like to be fully present in a moment, to care deeply about something beyond his own grief. It felt good, terrifying, but good. Like waking up after a long sleep and discovering the world had kept turning without you, and maybe it was time to start turning with it again. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to find a text from Elizabeth. I've drafted the communications regarding Morris and Blake. They'll go out first thing Monday morning. Also, Mr. Ashford, it's good to have you back. Thorn smiled at that. Maybe he was back. Maybe tonight had been the first step in a longer journey toward whatever came next. He thought about Celeste, about the coffee they'd have next week, about the possibility of building something new from the ruins of what he'd lost. Not a replacement for Amelia. Nothing could ever replace her, but a different kind of life. One where he didn't just observe the world from the shadows, but participated in it again, even with all the risk and pain that participation required. The night air smelled like rain and possibility, and for the first time in 5 years, Thorn Ashford walked home feeling like maybe, just maybe, he was ready to be more than a ghost in his own story. Behind him, the city continued its endless dance of light and shadow, indifferent to the small moments of courage and connection that happened in its countless corners every night. But those moments mattered anyway, Thorn thought. They mattered because people chose to make them matter, chose to stand up when it was easier to sit down, chose to care when caring came with a cost. Tonight, he'd made that choice, and tomorrow he'd make it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. One choice at a time. One step at a time. One corner booth left empty because he'd finally found something more important than hiding. It was a start. And sometimes, Thorn reflected as he let himself into his building and nodded to the night security guard. Sometimes a start was all you needed. The rest would come in its own time, in its own way, if you were brave enough to let it.